You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome. I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us. On today's show, we'll explore the thin line in striking a balance between national security and individual rights. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awuni. Now, as governments the world over move to find a balance between national security and individual rights, Kirsty Brimelow, the chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee, joined me to put this in perspective.
There's no statutory definition of national security. We need to be very careful when it's used. Obviously, it needs to be used because you're looking at basically at the safety of citizens and you're looking at the safety of a nation. However, the big danger with national security is that it is used as an excuse in order to round up people and not apply proper due process, so not apply the rule of law. Examples of that are in Egypt. In Turkey in particular, there's many lawyers and judges who are still in prison on the basis of it's in national security. Some of them are gradually being released because there simply is no evidence against them, which is evidence which supports a charge. So ultimately there must be a legal framework with which you're taking away somebody's liberty. With national security as well, if the life of the nation is at risk, if it's very extreme, then you can apply to opt out of certain rights to individuals, and you would give a notice to the United Nations that you are opting out in some degree on the international law framework. But here in Nigeria, before you got to that stage, you would have to get the permission and the vote through the National Assembly. So there are provisions to deal with extreme situations, but it's within a legal framework. And the difficulty here, what's happening here, is that even when judges are making orders, there's your legal framework, there's your judgment, it's being ignored by the executive. Now that is arbitrary detention, and really what needs to happen is there needs to be more challenges by lawyers against this arbitrary detention using the international law framework. The importance of that is not foreign law. What it is Nigeria has promised to all its states that it will treat its citizens in a certain way when it's ratified the treaties. So if it's not doing that, such as holding people who the courts are saying should be released, the lawyers should be complaining to the international law monitoring bodies to say it's in breach of the treaties. The ICCPR is one of the major treaties that Nigeria consistently is in breach of. And there needs to be action. There also needs to be political pressure within the African Union as to how the state is behaving.
Do you think that sometimes, because that's what we've seen in many instances, that it's political. Sometimes it could be quite obvious that obviously the government doesn't quite have sufficient evidence, and there's a lot of sidestep and there's a lot of talk and lip service, but those individuals still remain in custody. So my question is, for those category of individuals, where can they seek help? Still within the bandits.
I think very interesting point you make, because there's another issue here, which is lack of investigation. So there's a real reliance on extracted confessions, and these confessions are often forced, often obtained through torture, or obtained in a way that's unfair. So they've even been written in languages which the person doesn't even understand. And so gradually the courts are getting hold of this and ruling it admissible. Now, if there was more training and more resources into the police that they must investigate, into the security services, there must be investigation to get evidence, this situation would not arise where there's insufficient evidence, and so therefore the executive is overreaching. Where do they go next? I would say that one thing the NBA has done is it's set up a pro bono unit for lawyers. We within the UK, none of these problems are unique to Nigeria. They're universal issues, and tackling terrorism should not be underestimated. It's a universal threat. And so we need to use the laws. So you need lawyers who are actually acting for those people who might be being arbitrarily detained in order to take their case to the ECOWAS court, go to the regional court. That's the one above your domestic level, or use the UN.
Like you said, it's not, this terrorism is not unique to Nigeria. No. The UK too. There have been even recent instances, and I know that for the UK, they're kept in government custody and they're actually charged to court. There's a proper trial, and if they're found guilty, they're taken, they're jailed. I'm just wondering, what lessons or what leave can Nigeria take from that, from the UK's situation or scenario in terms of going through the process?
I think the lessons that could be taken would be to strengthen the organisations and the committees that are looking at the bills as they're passing through into legislation. So we have a cross-party Human Rights Committee, which, for example, at the moment there's a new anti-terrorism bill going through. And there's a lot of concerns about some of the clauses within it, which are basically going to be criminalising thought, criminalising research. If you look up a Boko Haram pronouncement, you might therefore fall foul of one of these sections in this bill going through. So that's all being debated at the moment. So if some of these laws were addressed before they came into law and those arguments were made in advance, you would not have some of the bad clauses that you still have within the 2013 Prevention of Terrorism Act, for example. The other thing I think lawyers can do more is really get out there more with the academic articles to set people right. And set up much more civil society institutions which are setting people right on what the legal framework is. There's an automatic fear with terrorist cases, but if people understand that actually it's the hard cases that make the good law, then that is actually the sign that the law is operating.
Do you think that also in itself is a very big obstacle? Because I'm thinking for civil society, if the government presents this particular individual or suspect in a manner that speaks or presents so much fear and dread, and I feel like maybe in some instances civil society might find it difficult to come out and defend and insist that the rule of law, be upheld. Yeah,
I think that is a problem because they're not popular cases, and so whether there needs to be more emphasis on the lawyers, that the lawyers are doing that. So certainly within the UK, there can sometimes be confusion in the press associating the lawyer who's defending the person accused of a terrorism offence. And we are able as an organisation to slam down on that. The Bar Council slams down on it very quickly to make the distinction that what all the fascists did in history was trying to associate the lawyers with clients who were accused of something particularly grave rather. And they've done exactly the same thing in Turkey. So this is a fascist approach. So what I suggest is we learn much more from our history in order to stop repeating the same issues, the same errors, the same mistakes. And there's international support, and Nigeria should draw on it.
Back to the issue of national security, like you said, like we've established, it's not in the constitution. Nigeria, for example,
no
it's not in the
definition,
constitution, but you've said that there are ways in which that can be debated upon, and tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's understood that national security is an issue for all nations. So basically after 9/11 there was a resolution through the UN Security Council that states should be domesticating anti-terrorism law, so to deal with preparation for terrorism, these in order to try and stop the actual killings. Nigeria actually was very slow doing this. It took about 10 years because there was a lot of political factions that this is targeting Muslims, this is targeting the North. There was a lot of concern as to the effect of those laws. And so the law you got ended up being passed through very quickly on an executive order. As to what you can do, if there is an issue where there is actually a complete threat to the nation itself, to the stability of governance, to all that.
And in that instance where it's been proven by the government?
Yes, I mean it's quite an extreme situation.
Okay.
So, well, not exactly proven by the government, but it's examined. Okay. So, but you would be doing it through your National Assembly because it's a major thing to say we are now going to suspend some of our constitutional rights here because they're there to safeguard everybody. And the difficulty when you start just randomly lifting those on the basis of national security, it becomes a very wide net. So I might be a mechanic, for example, and this has happened, just going about my daily business servicing a car, and that car at one point belonged to a Boko Haram soldier, and I suddenly find myself caught up and thrown in prison for 8 years. Now, that is not a functioning system. What should have happened is that there should have been a quick look at an urgent look at what the evidence is, and then due process should have worked. Now that's still looking at national security, but it's ensuring that your laws are working to enable a fair trial and a fair hearing, and all the usual caveats. So I think what I'm saying basically is that there should not be a different due process that applies to cases which involve terrorism, that apply to cases of, for example, somebody who's accused of committing mass murder. And we need to keep sight of that.
Do you think it's worse in countries, especially here in developing countries in Africa, where institutions are still quite weak, especially an institution like the judiciary that's still quite weak and it has so many cracks, and some of these cracks are actually taken advantage of?
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent would you say that would also go in hindering upholding the rule of law?
I mean, there is that major challenge in Nigeria, including how the courts are functioning. However, you have, for example, a National Human Rights Commission. The same issue with that, it doesn't function with any strength, but that has powers also to assist with these cases where people are being detained arbitrarily in prison. So that should do more. What you can do to enhance it, people need to try them more. I think a lot of people just give up. They think there's no point in me writing to the National Human Rights Commission. I tried once before, they didn't reply. That's normal, but you just need to keep at them, and that includes families. So I'd say education's a massive part. If you have your child might have been rounded up, your husband, son, whoever, daughter has been rounded up, you need to know who you can possibly contact. So a lot of these people are very poor, and I don't think it's necessarily that they have no faith. They also don't know where to go. So I think there can be more transparency.
I've been speaking to Kirsty Brimelow, Chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee. We're continuing our focus on striking a balance between national security and individual rights. Earlier, Kirsty Brimelow, the Chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee, joined us for this discussion.
So I'm a QC, Queen's Counsel at Doughty Street Chambers, and I'm head of the international law section there. So my practice in the courts is in international human rights, also in criminal law and public law. So I work domestically in the courts in the UK, but also in the Caribbean courts and also internationally. So, for example, I've been mediating between a peace community in the north of Colombia and the Colombian government in order to try and implement a court order. I'm chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales. Now, this is an organisation of barristers who work pro bono in human rights, and so they're practicing barristers. We also have students, law students, and we have academics. They give up their time for free to, where invited to do so, intervene to support lawyers, in particular families, in people in other countries where there is a potential breach of a legal framework, and they want assistance. We also do trial observations, so we've been doing a lot of those in Turkey and Egypt, where observers are going to look at whether the trials are being conducted to international law standards, and where there's a consideration that in fact it's a sort of show trial, it's a kangaroo court, and so we do observations on that as well.
Okay, now, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, you've done work in Turkey, also what we've seen in the gross violation of human rights. But you know, we have the International Criminal Court that's also, I mean, many times looks at war crimes and all of that, but what kind of cases typically go to the International Criminal Court, and is there a space for such cases where, you know, there's been gross violation of human rights? Can those people go to the ICC?
Yeah, so the answer to that is there's already a preliminary examination that's been opened into Nigeria by the International Criminal Court. The good thing with Nigeria is it supported remaining within the International Criminal Court at the time when many of the African countries were pulling out of it. So it's quite a conflict. It believes in the international law framework as a state, but then there's a sort of another kind of confusion within that. So there is already an investigation, and it's investigating both Boko Haram and the Nigerian military. The cases that go to the international court, putting it broadly, are the very serious, the genocide, crimes against humanity. There's also recently a crime of aggression which can be tried. So your individual breaches, you could not go to the ICC. Where you would go is you would go to your regional court. So you don't have to exhaust going through your domestic courts. You could go straight to your regional courts if your domestic courts aren't functioning.
Now, in the northeastern part of the country, obviously, where we have the militant insurgency, we also have a heavy presence of army security personnel who are there to, of course, keep the peace and curb the insurgency. But they've also come, in the line of fire. By that I mean, have come under heavy criticism about their conduct sometimes, especially when handling victims those who have been victims of the insurgency and are now displaced. I'm talking about the internally displaced persons. And many times, the government has had to come to their defense. And I know the international human rights organizations have also criticized them. So, but I just feel like sometimes there's a conflict between how does the government
on one hand, defend them because they are the ones, keeping the territorial integrity of the nation and fighting this insurgency, and then also ensuring that they also stay within the ambit of the law. And by that, I mean that not trampling on the rights of those victims, as it were. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, how you practically do it is always a very good question. They need to be, so the military, it's not a straightforward or easy job. And the military, in some respects, in some places, has done an excellent job. There's also stories in northeast of South African vigilantes who, in fact, have been fighting there, which very shadowy. So there's that side going on as well. So, but everybody, when they are engaged in combat, are also engaged in a legal framework. And there's obviously a reason for that. Otherwise, everybody, it would be entirely lawless. And the legal framework came out of a lawless situation. And that was when all the countries, really, with the millions that were slain after World War II, all the countries agreed that, in fact, we cannot have this happening again. We cannot just trust the states to say to the military, it's okay, you can go and just massacre people here, we'll back you. There's an international law framework that they have to answer to, and the state has to answer to. And I think sometimes that is what's missing here.
So when you look across the African continent in terms of how they're upholding the rule of law, what are your thoughts? Would you say that there's progress being made, and would you say that certain regions are doing a better job than other regions?
Yeah, I think that there are certain regions doing a lot better. They all have different challenges. Nigeria is a real concern recently with the Boko Haram trials, that the old techniques of roundup and disappearance into the military barracks has been used, and we hope that there've been progress past that. The government says it's a new type of terror. Nigeria has a very violent history, and a lot of the laws have come in looking at how massacres have occurred in the past, and in order to try and learn lessons that should not happen again. The right to somebody's life obviously is a fundamental right, and it needs to be respected, because the problem is once you start taking on the hard cases and removing the rights of those people, we'll just extrajudicially kill those people, that creeps. And so the person who might have lent money to somebody, and that money ends up in a funding, which might have gone a funding to a terrorist organisation, but you didn't know about it. You might find that then you also are thrown in prison. So you might be an investor, you might be a very wealthy investor who has been hoodwinked. And so once the rule of law starts to shake that way, people will lose confidence in the country as a whole. And we've seen that happen in many countries in West Africa, which is why it's crucial you have strong leadership at the top that actually will say that we ratify the international law framework, and we are complying with that international law framework, even in the really difficult cases such as the Boko Haram cases. So what we should see looking forward is looking at these trials. It's a good opportunity. There needs to be sufficient prosecutors, sufficient lawyers. The trials need to take enough time so that the person is able to give instructions to the lawyer so that they can be represented properly. The evidence needs to be given to the lawyer, to the suspect, so that they know in a language they understand. And if due process can happen with those cases, then that is a good example of Nigeria actually saying we are respecting due process in our hardest of cases. So it's an opportunity.
What about the role of the Nigerian Bar Association? I mean, a comment was made about how that perhaps the bar also needs to do more. I mean, it sees these things happen often, and there's that perception that it doesn't actually do enough. So what would you recommend in terms of how the NBA can step forward?
Yeah, I mean, my dealings with the NBA have been very positive, but my particular relationship has been obviously with the current executive and with the current president, A.B. Mahmood San, and he made some very powerful remarks about human rights and rule of law in his opening comments, which was very gratifying to see. So I'd say it needs to do more of what he's been doing. It needs to continue partnerships really such as ours with the Bar Human Rights Committee. So to say we're working pro bono, there's nothing in it for us other than to support the local lawyers in order to enable the local lawyers to access other justice mechanisms. And I think lawyers here, the NBA, needs to start thinking a different way. All NBA lawyers that I've come across many. It's always constitution, 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 which is very important. But Nigeria, for a very long time, has made promises on an international stage. So use those promises, and look at the history of the country as well. And that way, you can stabilise it. And that way, if you start to allow access to people to justice as well, you're working towards lifting people out of poverty. Because obviously alongside all of this is the social development issue. Why are you getting these terrorist attacks in the first place? Why is this all happening? Why is this peak in violence? So the development side also needs to be looked at alongside. And added to that, corruption must be dealt with. Corruption has to be dealt with.
Do you think that the task of the NBA will be a lot difficult when at the top, I'm talking about the president now, also has an interesting view, as it were, on what the rule of law should be, and that there are instances where it could actually be set aside? Because I also spoke to Mr. Mahmoud himself, and obviously he expresses displeasure at the comments of the president, where he insinuated that there are times when the rights of an individual can be suspended. So I'm just wondering, how do you address that when you as an MP, as a body, you want to be seen to also uphold the rule of law and stand for what justice, but the government in power has a different opinion on that. Yeah. What do you do?
Again, it's not unusual. We had in the UK, there was a case which upset a lot of people, which was going to the Supreme Court concerning Brexit. And so in the UK, one of our tabloid newspapers had photographs of all the Supreme Court justices with the headline, "Enemies of the People." And this was very extreme. And so what you do need is a very strong court institution. We've got a very strong Supreme Court. It didn't bother them at all, and they continued ahead with very detailed ruling. However, there was concern at the time that the press had gone so far with this that there needed to be, from the government, there needed to be pronouncements from the government condemning this and emphasising the separation of powers. So you need to keep the government's nose out of the courts. Otherwise, again, experience shows if you have the overreaching of the government, of the politics into the courts, then none of that is going to be for the benefit of the people. It's a disaster. So you need, within the government, you have an Attorney General. Attorney General's political, but you need somebody strong within the government who's able to speak out on behalf of lawyers, courts, judges who are being perhaps pilloried when they're making unpopular decisions, and also lawyers. Lawyers need to be speaking out and explaining matters more.
And perhaps the press too. Obviously.
Yeah.
Perhaps the media too. Obviously.
Media. But you're always going to with these cases, because it's populist opinion. It's very popular to say, "Oh, I would hang them all. I would why bother with a court, because they're playing by different rules." But that's just not understanding what a rule of law system is, because it's incorporating national security within the rule of law system. It's incorporated in there, and it's incorporated in a way that it's keeping the politics and the governments consistently cannot be trusted. When people get in power, they want to stay in power. I'm going to say this because it's popular. An election's coming up, and so that's where there needs to be a constant reminder of, in fact, what the international law framework is. It's very easy with Nigeria. Just refer to what the ICCPR is. Refer to all the states. There's not even a state of emergency. Look at the case he's referred to. You can see that has no correlation to the comments he made. And I would, if I was in the position here, I would be pushing my government for correction, as I've done in the past, and writing and saying, I want a response from you to correct what you've said. I'm putting them on the spot. And I've certainly written to Theresa May, for example, who was here at the moment when she was Home Secretary, about various pronouncements she made.
That was Kirsty Brimelow, Chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee. With that said, on Beyond Markets, thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch all previous episodes of the show on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Market, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awoni. From myself and the team, to have a great day.